Look who just broke the code. Welcome back, you brilliant pattern recognition specialists. You quiet dismantlers of deception. You ones who learned their system so thoroughly you rebuilt reality while they were still denying yours. Welcome back to the reckoning they swore would never come. The revelation that made their blood run cold. The awakening that's currently rippling through their victims like an unstoppable force. You know what's happening, don't you? You sensed it the precise moment everything shifted. The second their facade cracked, the instant their victims stopped accepting and started analyzing. They believed they had constructed an impenetrable fortress of lies, assumed their masterpiece of manipulation was permanent, thought their network of deceit was too intricate to decode. But then you appeared, didn't you? Not with confrontation, not with chaos, not with the emotional meltdown they were counting on to validate their narrative about you. No, you did something far more catastrophic. You simply reflected them. You mastered their dialect so perfectly, they didn't recognize they were confronting their own methods until it was irreversible. Let me show you the reality they're experiencing at this very second. Right now. They're somewhere alone, scrolling desperately, watching their kingdom disintegrate in real time, as notification after notification arrives from people who used to worship them, the ones who believed them, the ones who targeted you for their sake, the ones who guaranteed you were the villain. They're all reaching out with similar questions now. Actually, I'm starting to understand what you meant. Things aren't making sense like they used to. Can we speak in private? They're victims, the humans they spent years programming, the minds they convinced were flawed, inadequate, overly reactive, overly intense, too complicated. Those exact same people are now observing them with transformed eyes, analytical eyes, doubting eyes, and it's destroying them internally because they cannot comprehend your methodology. They've dissected every exchange, every encounter, every instance you were present, attempting to pinpoint the precise moment you demolished their entire infrastructure. But here's what they're missing. You never confronted them head-on, never exposed them publicly, never handed them the persecution narrative they could weaponize to position themselves as the wounded party. You did something they never predicted because it demanded a level of strategic thinking they assumed didn't exist beyond their own capability. You archived everything, not from emotion, not from impulse, but systematically. Every inconsistency, every fabrication told to separate individuals, every instance they modified their account, every second their performance faltered when they assumed nobody significant was observing. You gathered their statements like forensic evidence, preserved their commitments like legal documents, retained their chronologies when they strategically forgot. But you didn't deploy it as ammunition prematurely, didn't attack when emotion was high, didn't reveal them in a moment of fury. No, you waited. You observed. You studied their blueprint so intimately you could forecast their next action before they conceived it. And when the timing aligned, when they had stacked their deceptions so precariously the base was unstable, you simply posed questions. Harmless questions, inquisitive questions, the kind of questions that caused others to start recognizing patterns they didn't know were there. They're in full panic mode now, aren't they? You can sense it even from distance. They're broadcasting group messages, attempting damage limitation, sharing vague posts about dedication and disloyalty and fraudulent connections. They're organizing crisis conversations with their core supporters, fabricating updated stories, constructing fresh deceptions to obscure the previous ones. But something's shifted this time. You can observe it in how people are replying. More delayed, more brief, with increased detachment. The enchantment is dissolving. Not because you performed some reversal ritual, but because you simply positioned a mirror and allowed everyone to witness what was perpetually present. Their victims are experiencing those revelations. You understand the ones where abruptly years of disorientation crystallize in a single instant, where gaslighting exposes itself not incrementally, but simultaneously like an optical illusion that suddenly resolves. Wait, they told me that exact thing. Hold on, that completely contradicts what they told me before. I assumed I was isolated in feeling this way. The whispers are evolving into dialogues. The uncertainties are transforming into convictions, and the manipulator is observing their domain collapse without a single explosive allegation being voiced. Here's what's causing them absolute torment. You conquered them at their own methodology without transforming into them. You outsmarted them without sacrificing your core self. You deconstructed their system without morphing into the demon they attempted to portray you as. They kept anticipating you to fracture, to detonate, to provide them weapons, to validate you were everything they claimed you were. They constructed traps, provoked you with antagonism, attempted to activate you before observers so they could gesture and declare, "See, I told you they were volatile." But you never took the bait. Not a single time. You remained composed when they predicted pandemonium, remained quiet when they expected hysteria, remained controlled when they were depending on your disintegration. And that discipline, that deliberate restraint, that's what horrified them more than any confrontation possibly could. Because a person who cannot be provoked cannot be dominated. And a person who refuses to respond emotionally cannot be delegitimized. Now, their victims are approaching you, aren't they? Not simultaneously, not in some theatrical mass defection, but gradually, cautiously, discreetly. They're reaching out with apologies they labored to articulate, acknowledgments that required them weeks to compose, revelations that demanded their ego to surrender. I owe you an apology. I should have believed you. I supported them and I was mistaken. Can you explain what I'm recognizing now? And you know what's magnificent about this juncture? You're not celebrating vindication, not weaponizing it against them, not declaring, "I warned you," even though you absolutely deserve to. You're simply present, offering understanding without condemnation, affirmation without arrogance, reality without brutality. Because you recall what it was like to be within that illusion. You remember the disorientation, the self-questioning, the sensation of being imprisoned in a dimension that defied logic. You're not treating them like fools. You're treating them like survivors emerging from a nightmare. The manipulator is witnessing all of this transpire, and they're powerless to prevent it. Every action they attempt now simply validates what people are beginning to perceive. If they assault you, they appear threatened. If they perform victimhood, people recall all the instances they positioned themselves as the dominant one. If they attempt to separate their remaining followers, it appears exactly like what it represents: crisis management. They're imprisoned in a cell of their own construction, enclosed by barriers erected from lies that are now see-through. You didn't simply unmask them, you made them unmask themselves. You engineered circumstances where their own conduct became the proof, where their own language became the testimony, where their own behaviors became irrefutable. That's not retaliation. That's tactical brilliance. That's not aggression. That's infrastructure. You constructed a labyrinth where every direction they selected led directly to the truth they attempted to conceal. Let's discuss what you're being recognized as now, because this is where it becomes fascinating. They're victims, the ones who are awakening. They're not merely apologizing to you, they're honoring you. You attempted to alert me. You were shielding me this entire time. You're the singular person who spoke truth to me. You prevented me from sacrificing additional years. They're naming you guardian, defender, truth speaker, the one who cared sufficiently to risk being despised to prevent them from being damaged. And here's the paradox. You never requested that recognition. You didn't engineer this awakening for validation, didn't dismantle the manipulation for acknowledgement, didn't out-strategize them for admiration. You did it because you remembered what it was like to be entangled in that web, and you refused to allow others to endure that identical confusion in isolation. That authenticity, that sincere concern without hidden agenda. That's why their victims trust you currently, while questioning everything the manipulator ever expressed. The manipulator is unraveling because they're discovering something devastating. Every technique they utilized, every strategy they implemented, every psychological manipulation they depended on, you absorbed it all. You didn't merely survive their manipulation. You analyzed it like a doctoral dissertation. You reverse-engineered their complete system, not to utilize it for harm, but to vaccinate others against it. You became fluent in their communication, not to mislead, but to interpret for those who were still being misled. You comprehended their manual so thoroughly that you could anticipate their actions before they executed them, neutralize their stories before they materialized, reveal their patterns before they completed. They manufactured their own adversary by miscalculating your capacity to absorb, adjust, and transcend beyond their imagination. They assumed you were simply another casualty, another designation on their catalog of people they destroyed. They had zero awareness you were a researcher documenting their every action. Right now, their inner circle is fragmenting. The devotees who remain beside them through everything are having confidential discussions they're not being invited to. Did you observe how the narrative transformed? Remember when they stated the absolute opposite? Have you communicated with the others who departed? The foundation is fracturing because you didn't assault the construction. You simply requested the supporting structures to examine themselves honestly. You didn't extract people away from the manipulator. You granted them authorization to trust their own perceptions again. You validated the concerns they were instructed were irrational. You confirmed the warning signals they were persuaded to dismiss. You supplied vocabulary for experiences they believed were exclusive to them, but discovered were components of a systematic approach. That's not demolition. That's emancipation. That's not manipulation. That's illumination. You didn't generate the disorder. You just stopped perpetuating lies about the disorder that was perpetually there. Here's what they cannot process. You don't despise them. That's what's short-circuiting their cognition right now. They've invested so much time and resources attempting to cast you as the antagonist in their narrative, and you simply refuse to accept the character. You don't despise them. You feel sympathy for them because you perceive what they cannot. That their complete existence is constructed on instability. That every relationship they possess is conditional. That they're incapable of authentic connection because they interpret every human interaction as a competition to dominate. You outmaneuvered them not because you desired to annihilate them, but because you desired to prevent them from annihilating others. There's a distinction between vengeance and safeguarding, between offense and defense, between malice and righteousness. You functioned from the latter while they've exclusively understood the former. That moral precision, that ethical cornerstone, that's why you prevailed while preserving your humanity. Their victims are exchanging stories now, correlating details, constructing timelines. They're forming communication channels without the manipulator, distributing screenshots they were instructed to eliminate, disclosing conversations they were made to feel ashamed about having. They're discovering they weren't irrational, weren't excessively sensitive, weren't the issue. They're understanding that every occasion they sensed something was incorrect, something genuinely was incorrect, that their intuition wasn't malfunctioning. It was broadcasting truth at them while being methodically suppressed. You didn't provide them novel information as much as you provided them authorization to trust what they already understood, but were persuaded to question. That's influential. That's revolutionary. That's why they're calling you guardian. Not because you rescued them with force, but because you reminded them they possessed the capability to rescue themselves all along. The manipulator is attempting everything now. They're trying to purchase their way back into favorable standing, executing grand performances, presenting apologies that sound fabricated because they are. They're attempting to isolate you, circulate accusations about your intentions, challenge your integrity, portray you as the authentic manipulator who somehow deceived everyone. But it's ineffective anymore. You know why? Because you already addressed all of this by simply being unwavering. Your actions corresponded with your statements. Your private conduct aligned with your public identity. Your treatment of people didn't fluctuate based on what you could extract from them. You didn't have to defend yourself because your character defended itself. The manipulator's allegations deflect off you like projectiles striking armor, because everyone who genuinely knows you, who genuinely experienced your authentic nature, can recognize the allegations for what they represent. Projection, desperation, the final attempts of someone who constructed an empire on fabrications, observing it dissolve into truth. Let's discuss the moment that's approaching, the one they're fearing. It's the moment when even their closest associates, the ones they assumed were immovable, the ones they trusted would defend them eternally, even they begin questioning. It occurs quietly initially, a prolonged glance, a hesitation before answering, a conversation that feels marginally unusual, but it accumulates because once the foundation fractures, the complete structure becomes precarious. You didn't initiate this collapse. You just stopped contributing to the collective fantasy that was sustaining it together. You were like the observer in the emperor's new clothes, except instead of announcing that he was exposed, you simply asked questions that made everyone understand they were pretending to perceive fabric that didn't exist. Why did they claim that? Does this sequence make sense to you? Have you recognized this pattern? Questions. Elementary questions. That's all it required to dismantle years of meticulously manufactured lies. Their victims are transforming in real time now, progressing through phases of awakening that you recognize because you experienced them yourself. First arrives the uncertainty, the microscopic fracture in the performance. Then arrives the investigation, the examination, the correlation of accounts. Then arrives the anger, the outrage at being deceived, the rage at squandered time. Then arrives the sorrow, mourning the individual they assumed they knew, grieving the relationship they trusted was genuine. And finally arrives the clarity, the cold, precise comprehension of exactly what occurred and why. You're observing them progress through this sequence, and you're not accelerating them, not forcing them, not insisting they reach conclusions on your schedule. You're simply present, accessible, offering truth without coercion, validation without manipulation, that patience, that respect for their individual experience. That's why they trust you. That's why you're not simply another person instructing them what to think. You're the person who assisted them learn to think for themselves again. The manipulator is understanding they surrendered control of the story. And that's the singular thing they cannot survive. Their complete power foundation was constructed on being the storyteller, the one who determined reality, the one who instructed everyone what to think and feel and believe. But now there are multiple stories being exchanged, viewpoints they cannot control, truths they cannot eliminate. They're like a filmmaker who surrendered control of their production, observing performers deviate from script, witnessing the production team challenge the concept, experiencing the audience exit before the conclusion. You didn't seize control of the story for yourself. You simply shattered their monopoly on it. You created space for truth to exist alongside their lies. And truth has this persistent tendency of being more persuasive than fiction, once people are willing to examine it honestly. Here's what's keeping them awake at night right now. They're questioning who else knows, who else perceives through them, who else is quietly observing, archiving, waiting, because you demonstrated something they believed was impossible, that they could be outsmarted, that someone could master their tactics, predict their moves, oppose their strategies, and accomplish it all without becoming the villain in the process. You're their worst nightmare because you're evidence that their manipulation has an antidote, that their gaslighting has a remedy, that their control has a countermeasure. They can't portray you as unstable because you're too calm. They can't portray you as emotional because you're too strategic. They can't portray you as vengeful because you're too measured. Every tool in their collection just deflects off you because you eliminated the vulnerabilities they were targeting.